Regulatory Update, Distance Education, featuring Greg Martin, Director, Policy Development Group.
Hello, I'm Greg Martin with the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and I'd like to welcome you to our session today, session 12, which is a regulatory update on distance education and innovation. Let's start by going over our agenda. We'll have a brief introduction, then I'll talk a little bit about the history and implementation of the regulations, and then we'll do an overview of the major provisions. First, I'll start with the notice of proposed rulemaking that we had, which was published on April 2nd, 2020. We had a comment period, which ended May 4, 2020. We had final rules published on September 2nd of 2020, and an effective date of July 1st, 2020. But I do want to point out that all of the provisions in this regulatory package are available for early implementation, with you being able to choose any or all of the package to implement early. If you do so, you should document which of the regulations you are implementing early. Otherwise, they'll all take effect on July 1 of 2020. I want to point out before starting this first slide on academic engagement that this presentation is not an exhaustive overview of the regulations. We don't have time for that today. What I've done is try to hit the highlights of the regulations, so I would encourage all of you to go take an actual look at the regulation and to read through the preamble after this session is over. Okay, academic engagement. Let's talk about some of the current regulations regarding that. We don't have any definition of academic engagement in the current regulations. The R2T4 regulations in 668.22 set requirements for activities that may be considered academic attendance or attendance in an academically related activity. And this is used as the basis for establishing a student's withdrawal, but it pertained only to 34 CFR 668.22. Most of what was in 668.22 relating to requirements for academic attendance and attendance at academically related activities was incorporated into a definition of academic engagement that we'll now find under Part 600. It's applicable to R2T4 and other applications within 34 CFR Parts 600 and 668, so it's sort of an overall definition. And it specifies that academic engagement includes interactive tutorials or webinars. It also clarifies that merely logging into a class or online tutorial is not considered to be academic engagement, and that's sort of a long-standing regulation that we've just moved over here into this new reg. Next, we'll take a look at the definition of a clock hour. So we have made some revisions. We did have a definition of a clock hour in place, but we've made some revisions here. So a clock hour is defined as a 50 to 60 minute period of attendance in a synchronous or asynchronous class. And that's important to point out. That's a difference from what the proposed rule said. So it can be synchronous or asynchronous class or recitation where there is an opportunity for direct interaction between the instructor and students. So it can be synchronous, or here you see asynchronous learning activity involving academic engagement in which the student interacts with technology that can monitor and document the amount of time the student participates in the activity. So what we're doing here is clarifying that programs offered via distance education can be measured in clock hours, and there never was any prohibition on that. We just are clarifying that a clock hour program can include distance education. And it does require that institutions be capable of monitoring a student's participation during 50 minutes out of the 60 minutes in each hour. Next, we'll take a look at a credit hour definition. These regulations also modified the definition of a credit hour, retained a lot of what was there, but made some important changes. We now define a credit hour as an amount of student work defined by an institution as approved by the institution's accrediting agency or state approval agency that is consistent with commonly accepted practice in post-secondary education. And you'll see here that it reasonably approximates not less than 1 hour of classroom or direct faculty instruction and a minimum of 2 hours of out-of-class work in each week. So that we carried over from the previous regulation. And calculating credit hours may take into account a variety of delivery methods, measurements of student work, academic calendars, disciplines, and degree levels. So we point out here that there is some flexibility in calculating what a credit hour is. Correspondence course and student, we also made some revisions to this regulation as well. Correspondence course, now the definition refers to instructors rather than the instructor and recognizes the use of multiple instructors, and also recognizes the possibility of using a team teaching approach in offering correspondence education. The correspondence student is defined as one whose enrollment in correspondence courses is no more than 50% of the courses in which the student is enrolled during the award year. So I would point out here the current regulations do not define what a correspondent student is. So that is an addition with these new regulations. Next, let's move to some points about institutional eligibility and a requirement for ed to make a timely eligibility or certification decision. So these regulations now require the department to take prompt action on any materially complete initial application or reapplication submitted. If ed does not make a determination to grant or deny certification within 12 months of the expiration of the institution's current period of participation, that institution will automatically be granted a renewal of certification. I point out here that that certification may be provisional, but this does obligate the department to take action within a certain period of time, and that is new. Distance education definition now refers to the instructor or instructors rather than simply the instructor, so recognizing innovations in that area that involve a team approach. We've eliminated references to various types of media described in the current regulation that may be somewhat antiquated, for example, DVDs or CD-ROMs, and replaced that with just a reference to other media, which will take into account the future development in this field as well. We also define as an instructor as an individual responsible for delivering course content and who meets the qualifications for instruction that are established by the institution's accrediting agency. This is not new. It's something we're all familiar with, the requirement that distance education includes substantive interaction. But previously, we did not define what substantive interaction is. These regulations do that. Substantive interaction would be defined as engaging students in teaching, learning, and assessment consistent with the content under discussion, and including two of the following: providing direct instruction, assessing and providing feedback on a student's coursework, providing information corresponding to questions about content, facilitating group instruction, or other instructional activities that are approved by the programs or school's accrediting agency. So you can see here you have a variety of interactions that will be considered to be substantive, and you must meet two of those five. Remember that distance education not only must be substantive, but also regular, occur at regular intervals. The regulations here are somewhat broad in that regard and not prescriptive, taking into account various instructional methodologies. Institutions must ensure that regular interaction occurs between the student and an instructor or instructors. So prior to completion of a course or competency, it must provide the opportunity for substantive interactions with students on a predictable and regular basis. And that's as far as we go. We do not say it has to be 2 times a week or 3 times a week or so many times in any kind of a term or any other period. You are required to monitor the student's academic engagement and success and ensure the instructor is responsible for proactively engaging in substantive interaction with the student when needed or upon request. Clarification of incarcerated student. We made some changes here. An incarcerated student is one who is serving a criminal sentence in a federal, state, or local penitentiary, reformatory, work farm, juvenile justice facility, or other facility. Importantly here, a student is not considered incarcerated if that student is in a halfway house or home detention or is sentenced to only serving weekends. And for purposes of Pell Grant eligibility, a student incarcerated in a juvenile facility or local county facility is not considered to be incarcerated in a federal or state penal institution, regardless of which governmental entity operates or has jurisdiction over that facility. So we made some clarifications there to some questions we had in the past. Let's next discuss direct assessment. For direct assessment programs, department approval is still required, as has always been the case. And it is now only required for the institution's first direct assessment program. Approval is only required when the institution offers a direct assessment program at a different level of offering, that is, after the initial approval. So you only need to get additional approvals if, for example, you are offering a direct assessment at a higher level. For instance, the first one was a bachelor's degree, and now you're offering a master's degree. But if you are offering an additional program via direct assessment at the same level, additional approval would not be required. Any approval must be department approval. Anything that would not require department approval, rather, must be reported within 10 days of the change. And the institution is required to explain how it excludes credit hours earned through prior learning assessment from consideration of a student's eligibility for Title IV funds when conducting a direct assessment program. Some flexibilities here with direct assessment. It does permit, or the new regulations permit rather, preparatory coursework and coursework required by a state for teacher certification to be offered via direct assessment. It also allows programs offered in part through credit or clock hours and in part through credit hour equivalencies or clock hour equivalencies to be eligible direct assessment programs. And it requires institutions to establish a methodology to reasonably equate each module in the direct assessment program to either credit hours or clock hours. That's a statutory requirement, just reiterated here. Next, we'll talk about subscription-based programs. And it's not like these are new or that we haven't allowed them in the past. We just have regulations that now clarify what institutions must do when offering subscription-based programs and what those programs are. A subscription-based program is a standard or non-standard term program in which the institution charges a student for each term. Coursework would not be required to begin or end within a specific time frame for each term, and the expectation would be that the student completes a specified number of credits during the term. Students have to complete a cumulative number of credits or the equivalent during or following the end of each term before receiving subsequent disbursements of Title IV aid. And students would have to complete a cumulative number of credits or the equivalent during or following the end of each term before they can receive subsequent Title IV funds. For a subscription-based program, when we're looking at when a student is eligible for subsequent disbursements, we establish a method of determining the number of credit hours or equivalent a student in such a program must complete before receiving subsequent disbursements. So what you have to do here is determine for each term the minimum number of hours the student's enrollment status will require him or her to complete for that period of time, and add together, following the determination above, the number of credit hours determined for each term that the student enrolled in and attended. And you're able to exclude the current and most recently attended terms. So this is how you look at when the student is eligible for a subsequent disbursement, and it also obviates your having to do satisfactory academic progress for the quantitative portion of what is required for SAP. The rationale for this is that is that when a student in a subscription based program is eligible for a subsequent disbursement, following the non-term disbursement rules is more complicated for a CBE program than it would be for a non-term program with strict progression. So we have to figure out here when a student's going to be eligible for the next disbursement. Current requirements for this disbursement in a term-based program or non-term programs make it difficult to implement self-paced CBE programs. Requiring CBE coursework to begin and end within a specific time frame limits the students' flexibility to work with it within their own pace and can artificially delay progress. So this method allows for treating a subscription period as a payment period. And so when the student completes that subscription period or payment period, he or she is then eligible for the next disbursement. We require a student to complete a certain number of competencies in past subscription periods to receive Title IV funds in the subsequent subscription period. There's no requirement for a completion of specific competencies in a subscription period, and it permits coursework that overlaps or extends beyond the payment period start and end dates. It also allows Title IV disbursements at the start of the payment period, and it requires a student to have completed a number of credits or equivalent associated with that enrollment status in prior payment periods. So what we're requiring here is that when you set a student's enrollment status, that the student completes the number of credits associated with that enrollment status. This offers flexibility over current rules for self-paced programs that require completion of 1/2 the hours and weeks in the academic year in order for subsequent disbursement to take place. Some of the restrictions related to these types of programs are that they are limited to programs that charge students for each term on a subscription basis. There's an expectation that the student complete the specified number of competencies during the term. Repeat coursework may not be included in a student's enrollment status, and the institution must establish a single enrollment status that would apply to a student throughout his or her program. Next, we move to updating application information. These are some things we've added that institutions must do to apprise us of changes that have been made, and they do this by updating their e-app. So addition of a second or subsequent direct assessment program would have to be reported on the electronic application. And recall that although you wouldn't need the department's approval for a second or subsequent direct assessment program that was at the same credential level as the one before it, you would still have to report it within 10 days. The establishment of a written arrangement for an ineligible institution or to provide more than 25% of a program would also have to be reported. And again, these changes would have to be reported no later than 10 days after that change occurred. We make some clarifications with respect to written arrangements here. We have new rules involving workforce responsiveness, uh, allowing an institution to align or modify curriculum in order to meet the recommendations of advisory boards or industry recognized bodies. And we also here have included a calculation to determine the percentage of a program being offered by an ineligible entity. Written arrangements do not apply to the internship or externship portion of a program if the internship or externship is governed by accreditation agency standards, or in the case of an eligible foreign institution, the standards from an outside oversight entity. So we also make that clear in these changes to written arrangements. Next, let's take a look at clock to credit hour conversion. We've retained the clock to credit hour conversion requirement. What we essentially have done here is drop the requirement for outside work to be included and gone back to the pre-2010 conversion formula. So let's take a look at that. Semester, trimester hours must include 30 clock hours of instruction per semester or trimester hour. For quarter credit hours, the requirement is a 20-to-1 ratio. And as I indicated earlier, outside hours and or homework are no longer factors in the conversion. So this greatly simplifies the clock to credit hour conversion. Program participation agreement. We now require a reasonable relationship between program length and entry-level requirements. We did that in the past, but what we've done here is modify that to account for the fact that you sometimes have students attending programs in different states, and to hopefully make this a little more flexible. So what we consider reasonable, or a relationship we consider reasonable, is if the number of clock hours in the program does not exceed the greater of 150% of the minimum number of clock hours required for training in the recognized occupation as established by the state in which the institution is located, if the state has such a requirement, or the minimum number of clock hours required for training in a recognized occupation for which the program prepares a student in a state that is adjacent to the state in which the institution is located. So, for instance, if we took the example of New Jersey, New York being adjacent to New Jersey, you could also use the minimum number of clock hours required for training in the state of New York. SAP for subscription-based programs. So as I indicated earlier, there is no longer an SAP PACE calculation. So if you have a subscription-based program, because of the factors we talked about earlier that determine when a student is eligible for a subsequent disbursement, the need for an SAP PACE calculation is no longer there. A student is not eligible to receive a second or subsequent disbursement until the credit hours or equivalent associated with that enrollment status in all prior periods are completed. This will ensure a student cannot receive Title IV aid without progressing, and students are allowed an additional subscription period to catch up without losing eligibility for Title IV aid. Let's next take a look at non-term credit hour and clock hour programs. We have also eliminated the SAP PACE calculation here. Students are not able to receive a subsequent disbursement until one-half the hours or weeks in the academic year are successfully completed. So because we have this requirement that a student cannot receive a subsequent disbursement until those hours and or weeks are completed, there is no need for an SAP PACE calculation when it comes to non-term programs, so we have eliminated that. Maximum time frame. We made a few changes here as well. We still have a maximum time frame required for all programs. Undergraduate programs measured in credit hours may express the maximum time frame in terms of calendar time. So that is a difference over the current regulations. You do have this option to express that maximum time frame in calendar time. If you're going to do that, you want to make certain to read the preamble to the final regulations, which gives you some additional detail as to how to calculate that. GPA requirements for SAP remain unchanged across all types of programs. And as I say here, they are applicable to all programs. SAP policies must specify the GPA or comparable assessment measured against the norm that a student is required to achieve at each evaluation point. For a program of fewer than 2 academic years, by the end of the second academic year, the student must have achieved a GPA of at least a C or equivalent. So those are carried over from the previous SAP rules. Appeals. For appeals of a final, this is appeal for a final program review determination, not SAP appeals. So we want to make certain that we've moved on from SAP to a different topic here. Appeals of a final determination or final program review determination resulting from classification of a course or program as distance education or the institution's alignment of credit hours. If that occur in that appeal, we will rely on the institution's accreditation agency or state approval agency for the guidelines that we would apply. regarding qualifications for instruction, and also when determining if the work associated with the institution's credit hours align with commonly accepted practice. We will also look to the state and/or accreditor for those parameters as well. Return of Title IV funds. We have made some changes here as well. A student is considered withdrawn if they're unable to resume attendance within a payment period or period of enrollment for more than 60 days after ceasing attendance. And this is for subscription-based and non-term programs. So this is new. It's never considered rather I should say a subscription-based or non-term program is never considered to be offered using modules. So we make it clear here that if you have a subscription-based program or non-term program, even if you consider you have modules for Title IV purposes, you are not offering the education using modules. Students would be permitted to change the date of return if the student's program permits resumption of attendance no later than 60 days after the date the student ceased attendance. And you can only avoid withdrawal through written confirmation of future attendance if the student indicates the intent to resume attendance during the same payment period or period of enrollment. The student can also change the date that begins later in the same payment period as long as it is in writing and prior to the previously confirmed date. Students are not considered withdrawn if all graduation requirements for the program are completed before completing a number of days or hours in the program that the student was scheduled to complete. For a module program, if the student completes one module or a combination of modules that include 49% or more of the number of days in the payment period, excluding the scheduled breaks of 5 consecutive days or more, and all days between modules, or successfully completes the coursework equal to or greater than the coursework required for the definition of half-time, then the student is considered to have completed. So these are both modifications over the current R2T4 rules. Approved leaves of absence. Subscription-based programs are added to the types of programs that do not require the institution to permit the student to complete coursework he or she began prior to the leave of absence in order to grant an approved leave of absence. So basically, if you have obviously if you have a term-based program, it would be required that the student complete that coursework. This is just pointing out that if that program is subscription-based, then it would not be subject to that requirement. We've also changed the order of return, as you see here. So I'm not going to go through all of these. It is a little bit of a modification to the order of return, taking into account programs which have gone away, and it just kind of cleans that up. Number of days a student is scheduled to attend. And we make some clarifications here. For a student in a module program, the student is scheduled to complete the number of days in a module if the coursework in that module was used to determine the amount of a student's eligibility for Title IV HEA funds for that payment period. The institution may use the student's schedule at a fixed point to determine the number of days the student is scheduled to attend during the payment period, rather than having to do it throughout. Regulations do not prescribe this date. You can use a Pell Grant recalculation date, a census date, or any other date that you determine is acceptable. And you may also use multiple dates for this purpose as well. Next, we'll move to a discussion of changes that affect foreign institutions. Written arrangements between eligible foreign institutions. We now have made a change allowing an institution to execute a written arrangement with an eligible U.S. institution for that institution to provide no more than 25% of a student's eligible program at the foreign institution. Currently, or previously, I should say current regulations prohibit these types of arrangements with a foreign institution executing this arrangement with a domestic institution. It's now allowed. And they may execute a written arrangement with an ineligible foreign institution to provide no more than 25% of the student's eligible program, provided that institution meets the requirements of the definition of a foreign institution in 34 CFR 600.52, and I gave you those specific regulations there. There are limitations on attendance in the United States, so what we have done here is permitted students at eligible foreign institutions to come back to the United States and take some coursework, but we do have some limitations here. They may permit students to complete up to 25% of their program by enrolling in coursework at the U.S. institution, but that is all. Independent research done by a student in the U.S. for not more than one academic year is still permitted if it's conducted during a dissertation phase of a doctoral program, and the school may not stack the 25% allowance along with a dissertation for dissertation research allowance as well. If a school is in this situation, you should consult the preamble to the final rules, where there is an extensive discussion of this. Okay, here we see some information about audits and program reviews, and this information here is very similar or mirrors what we saw with the appeals language earlier. That for a final audit or program review determination, where there is a determination that results from the institution's classification of a course or program as distance education or the institution's assignment of credit hours, we are going to rely on the requirements of that institution's accrediting agency or state approval agency regarding qualifications for instruction and whether the amount of work associated with the institution's credit hours is consistent with commonly accepted practices in post-secondary education. So we would be relying on those entities in determining what the outcome of the review would be or audit in a final audit determination or final program review determination. I want to thank all of you for joining me today for this presentation, and I hope you have learned something useful from it. I do want to encourage all of you to refer to the actual final regulations, which are available on IFAP. If you read the preamble portion of those regulations, you'll get some valuable insights into how these regulations work and what the requirements are for schools to implement them. And I want to finally remind you again or reiterate that all of these rules can be implemented early. So you can decide which ones you want to implement and just make sure that you notate which regulations you have implemented early so that information can be made available to auditors or program reviewers should you be asked to share that. Thank you and have a good day.